I'm very happy to welcome the speaker, Professor Bittu Rajaraman from Ashoka University, to give the ICTS monthly colloquium. They will speak on the neural basis of math and language, connection and challenges. Bittu is an associate professor of biology at Ashoka University. They received a PhD from Harvard University in neuroscience and went on to become a DST Kothari postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Ecological Sciences, Indian Institute of Science, and then an Inspire faculty fellow at the Central University of Hyderabad. They work on the evolution of neural and behavioral systems of communication, the neuroethology of temporal pattern recognition in insects, and the quantitative and economic cognition more broadly in zebrafish, dogs, and humans.
All right, thank you very much. Okay, so again, 40 minutes or so, 45. Please feel free to interrupt me because, the goal is to, at least for me, working on largely numerical and quantitative cognition in fish and dogs. The interest for me is always in listening to people who do quantitative cognition with their, humans who do quantitative cognition with their heads, to sort of think about and engage with these questions, and to tell me what part of the way in which you do numerical cognition do you think is fun and worthy of investigation and so on. So these are the things that make this fun for me. So I'll give you a sense of what it is that, of the framework within which we're approaching numerical and quantitative cognition. So to start with, we do really basic computation, numerical computation in school. So early, schooling involves teaching us, teaching students communication, broadly speaking, a language, and elementary maths, right? So those are the building blocks of much elementary school pedagogy. Now, when it comes to communication, right? Of course, some particular language is picked, and you're taught completely arbitrary symbols, right? That stand in for, so both auditory kind of symbols in some sense, phonemes, and you can think of the written representation as another arbitrary set, and you're typically taught to associate meaning with some objects in the world and these arbitrary kind of vocal and written constructs. In addition, you are often, so you start off with concrete objects, right? So you start teaching a language, you teach, this is the chair, that is the table. But eventually you're going to be introducing abstract words that deal with the relationality of those things. So eventually you're going to say, my hand is on the table, not under, where the on is not a physical object that you can point to in some sense, but it's an abstract relationality between hand and table, right? That is being learned. So again, it's an associative learning between the number of times the word on is used and the way you see what happens between the word hand and the word table, etc. So abstract learning is done as advanced kind of language teaching happens. And often numerical or mathematical cognition also relies heavily on language. Because one of the first things you're teaching students it's not really about the numeracy of things. It is again about an abstract set of words, written form and vocal form. So you're first teaching people, this is one, this is two. So in fact, paradoxically, you start, numerical abstract cognition with, a sense of the concreteness of, this is one object, that is two objects, and so on. And then you hope that over time, the understanding of the abstract oneness or two-ness of something becomes apparent to students. So, it doesn't matter whether I'm saying one chair or one table, but you start to realize that there is a oneness that can be abstracted away from the particularity of the objects that I'm showing them at. And then after that, you build upon that and try to see if you can explain how these abstract twos may interact with each other or add on to each other or subtract from each other, and so on and so forth. All right, so for an exercise that deals with a lot of, so pedagogy, is ideally evidence-based. There's a large body of behavioral literature suggesting how people learn these things, right, from scratch. But, ideally, we would also have some evidence about how the system that's actually doing all of the processing, the brain, how it processes numbers. And this is a field with very, very little work in it. So little that But with the sustained work of really one or two sort of groups that have gone after this question, despite limited funding for a sort of blue sky question like this, we now know that there are number-sensitive neurons, right? So neurons that seem to respond to how many of an object is there rather than the particularity of that object. So we've just about found number-sensitive neurons in the brain, but we have no idea how brains, as a system, do 1 + 1 = 2, how abstract quantities, the abstraction of the number of objects, how manipulations between them are done. And of course, the end result of, if we were to really kind of pursue this field, then of course, eventually we might get to a point where the understanding of this is actually useful for people who do quantitative cognition, in their day-to-day lives, which is many of you, because often you are wrestling with your brain when you're trying to look at new or frontier challenges in quantitative cognition, right? And you're working with a brain whose mechanism is largely not understood. So the simple proposition is that this kind of work might one day be useful, right, in understanding how we do basic quantitative cognition. Now, you can't open up a human brain for various ethical reasons while quantitative cognition is going on. Methodologically, there's sort of a barrier, essentially, to figuring out how humans might do numerical and mathematical cognition. So it's an ethical barrier. You can do some kinds of things. I'll show you data on human brains that involves kind of looking at the brain from the outside without actually poking any holes into it. And that gives you some interesting data on the neighborhood where neural activity is happening while a mathematical challenge is being solved. But it tells you nothing about how single neurons actually start to compute these things, right? So how, what's the method by which neurons abstract this kind of information? So we need to figure out a good animal model system for in mathematical or numerical activity, and mercifully, for at least the 1 + 1 = 2 type stuff, there's some data suggesting that some animals might be able to do some of those simple tasks. So it's possible that we can at least, so basically there's two ways to crack at this. One is to improve the ways in which we detect single neuron resolution, neural activity in humans without doing anything invasive. So there's a methodological barrier that needs to be surmounted there. And in parallel, so essentially we can do non-invasive work in humans, but it's spatial and temporal resolution is terrible. So you're essentially getting some data from thousands of neurons, which tells you very little, and you're essentially looking at how much energy those neurons are consuming to get a sense of whether they're involved in a task. And then the other hand, sort of the simpler sort of tasks involved in quantitative cognition can be looked at in model organisms, where we can look at the functioning of the whole brain and get a sense of, with single neuron resolution, so you get a sense of how it is that the computation might be handled by the brain. But then, of course, the challenge is to find an animal that is imageable and teach it to do these quantitative cognition tasks. So I'll take you on a tour of what we know from animal behavior and so on for a little bit. And then we will turn to neural activity to understand numerical cognition in the brain. This is also made slightly more complicated by the fact that numerical and mathematical cognition is in theory something really, really simple for brains to do. In theory, a single neuron also does numerical computations when it's, say, figuring out whether it's brighter outside or inside, right? You are doing a comparative cognitive task, assessing the brightness of the light outside the room versus inside the room. So a lot of the simple tasks that you do are, in some sense, quantitative, right? So all neurons are taking tasks that may seem non-quantitative, such as, is your friend smiling at you genuinely, or is it a sarcastic smile? This sounds like something which is a hard to pick up social cue, and it is, but your brain is taking an image and processing the image to turn that kind of task into a quantitative cognition task, okay? So in some sense, all of what neurons do is act basically as initially an analog computer. Neurons that spike, as we call them, which is not all neurons in the brain, additionally kind of digitize that information. The output of a neuron is about a spike every 1 to 2 milliseconds or so. So with that degree of temporal, that is time-based resolution. Neurons are computing decisions about what kind of smile do I think it is, therefore do I approach, do I stay away, right? These are complicated and sometimes unpleasant social interactions, but your brain is processing them as a series of quantitative cognitive steps. So the question is, why, and you know, of course, you know that you can make a watch calculator do, you know, addition. You know that you can make a watch calculator do addition quicker and with better accuracy than you can train your own brain typically. So the question really is, if this is such a simple, you know, task, a task that you can theoretically engineer a really, really simple, small system to work on, while brains with their 86 billion neurons and 1,000 connections on average between neurons, right? So, I mean, each connection acts as an information conveying kind of node. So with that much computational power, why is it that we struggle to teach and learn quantitative cognition, right? That's one of the questions that we have to think about in the field. And, you know, the problem basically is that we have to solve is, why is this so difficult? You know, is there something that we're missing about how brains are structured? So one possibility is that it represents a task that is not ecologically as relevant as quantitative stimulus assessments. Open it. And, you know, what is useful then about counting, right? Is it just not a useful task? Therefore, even though brains have the computational power to do quantitative cognition, are they typically not wired in ways that do quantitative cognition or complicated quantitative cognition? So when is it useful, ecologically speaking, when you're not in a maths classroom? When is it useful to be able to perceive quantity? So you can argue that, you know, it might be useful in counting food or counting numbers of animals in a social group, or perhaps more interestingly, counting abstract things such as time. So now I've gotten very interested in time perception as possibly the most interesting kind of quantitative cognition that we do, because our reward systems are really intricately tuned towards figuring out the timing of reward relative to some kind of task, right? Essentially, to distinguish between reward that follows a task versus some reward that happened to spuriously be there before the task. So you know, in fact, there's a theory that if you didn't need to process reward timing, you might not need to process time at all. You know, that really timing and the neurodivergence that exists socially between people who are good with time versus not good with time might in fact deal with systems whose fundamental role is reward perception and reward timing perception. So, okay, so then, but you can see that all of the ecologically valid reasons proposed for doing quantitative cognition are basic quantity estimates, right? So is there more food here or there? Is there more predator here versus there? So one argument is that precise numerical cognition, right? So figuring out how to add two very large numbers, you know, in your head, maybe you know, a task that you can train your brain to do, but essentially the hardware you're using to do this has been evolutionarily shaped by very rudimentary quantitative cognition. So that's one theory for why it is that our very large brains are so bad at very simple numerical tasks. And therefore, it poses really the question of you know, the ways in which even if our brains are in some sense limiting agents in simple numerical cognition, what are all the ways in which our brains you know, limit complex quantitative cognition? Okay. So yeah, I mean, then there's a bunch of interesting questions that one can go on to ask, such as when we think we're doing abstract, you know, quantitative cognition, you know, there's interesting philosophical questions of sort of what does it mean for us to think we have solved something? You know, when you're trying, you know, one metric, which is sort of consistency, which is that you can take multiple paths to arrive at the same answer. What does it mean for a neural circuit to think that it has taken different paths? What makes one person take one path in terms of figuring out a solution to a problem, etc. So there's a bunch of fun questions that one can ask along this line. Okay. So, what is a eureka moment, right? What does that even mean? When is it that you feel, all of you know what it is to sort of keep track of a computation in your head, and at some point, a feeling slowly dawns on you that you've missed something, and then you go back. What does that mean, right? So there's a bunch of really fun questions that can be asked and answered at the behavioral level alone. Vinnal is suggesting that I say it's the end. Okay, so what are the ways in which we assess numerical cognition in animals? So one way is, similar to those ecological models. And in the ecologically valid examples, you can just see, how animals make choices between, say, groups of food, sets of food. So the simplest thing that is done is comparison of two numbers, right? So, you give an animal, 5 pieces of food versus 3, and you see whether, it's able to distinguish between them, first of all. And you rely on the fact that, presumably, an animal wants more food rather than less, which is not always the case. In fact, sometimes these hit against what it takes to satiate an animal. So as long as you're well underneath that, you assume and hope that these paradigms kind of might be able to elicit the ability of the animal to distinguish between two sets of numbers. The big problem when one is dealing with anything which is not an ecologically valid choice made in a natural circumstance. So for example, there's a bunch of work suggesting, for example, that wolves in the wild will, when they're making choices between which pack to go towards, will do a number of, they're on average making choices of going towards larger sized packs than smaller sized packs, etc. So, that's one possibility. But as soon as you're asking animals or you're training them to do a task that they're not doing in nature, but that's related to what they're doing in nature, then you hit up against a fundamental confound, and that is the confound between numbers versus quantity. So as I've said, a lot of the tasks that we see animals do are rough comparisons of the amount of food. Does it matter whether it's 4 pieces of food, or does it matter that it looks like a larger pile, right? And the problem with testing these paradigms is that typically you can't distinguish between, you can't control for all of the things that covary with the quantity of something, right? So if there are 2 lines, they will necessarily take up more space than 1 line. You could vary the thickness of the line so that, the line that shows 2 is thinner than the line that shows 1. And then if you were to do something like that, you would be able to distinguish. You would say, well, the line representing 2, and this is something we've done in an experiment, has the same overall surface area as the line representing 1. But even if you have control for surface area, right? So, instead of 2 fingers versus 1, I have to hold up 2 half fingers, right? And I say, okay, now the total surface area is the same. Am I still able to teach that this represents a different quantity than this, and that this is larger, right? Even though, so the number of objects is larger. But even if I control for quantity, I've not controlled for, broadly speaking, density. There's more things crowded into this space than this. So that's a cue that animals can use to kind of, even if an animal learns that this predicts a larger amount of food than this, I could argue that they're just doing pattern recognition. This pattern predicts, a larger amount of food than this. And I can't assume that the animals have inferred the numeracy, that is the number of objects, right, from this kind of task. And that's the key problem that delimits all studies of this kind. The practical solution that most behavioral biologists have found is to sequentially control. So in sequential trials, one of the things that covaries with quantity is controlled for. So in one trial, you control for surface area. In another trial, you control for density, but then you can't control for surface area, right? So you sequentially control for all the various things that can covary with quantity, and then you hope that means that instead of learning a different rule for each trial, the animal has abstracted numeracy as the only thing that remains consistent from trial to trial in predicting the amount of reward that's received, or just predicting the fact that a reward is received. There's a bunch of stuff that's specifically been done with chimpanzees, right, that has not been done with non-chimps. Or I'll show you examples of something that has been done with a non-chimp. But most of the work around similarity between 2 objects and a third object. So you provide 2 quantities and you ask the animal to, pick a third object that's similar to one of these so that you can see whether they recognize the quantity presented. Chimps can do these tasks even with fractions. So you can take an apple and give a quarter of an apple, or a half an apple and 2/4 of an apple, or 3/4 of an apple, and you'll see the chimps kind of prefer 3/4 over a whole half of an apple, and so on and so forth, right? So they seem to be able to do interesting fractional tasks as well. And again, it is largely primates where the association between symbols, since they're not typically speaking, and quantities has been teachable. So 1, 2, and so on have been teachable to primates. But there've been a couple of studies with dolphins as well, and a bunch of interesting work with birds. And perhaps the one that I'm most interested in is the expectation violation one. So expectation violation is one way to assess like addition or subtraction. And this has really only been successfully done with dogs, which is why we've also started to work on dogs in the lab. And the idea is that if you in front of me, behind a screen, drop 3 pieces of yummy food, and then you remove the screen, and I see only 2 pieces of food there, the question is that an expectation violation? And it could only be a violation of expectation if I'm kind of counting how many times something drops into that chute, right? The great advantage of dogs is that we typically don't have to spend a lot of time inculcating a relationship between dogs and humans so that one seems to infer what one thinks the dog is doing. Of course, the human-dog relationship also leads itself to all kinds of spurious inferences. So it's also a complicated system that way. But dog biologists think that the look that dogs give when something surprises them, which all of you know what I'm talking about, right? It's that, right? And there are a bunch of interesting studies looking at just when do dogs tilt their heads, right? What kinds of surprises count and don't count, and those are all associative studies, right? They're not really getting at causality. But the expectation violation studies on mathematics in dogs suggest that if you drop more items, and then when the screen is revealed, they see fewer, they look at the experimenter, right? Sometimes tilting their heads. Or they look at that for longer than they would if expectation is not violated for the same quantity. So then, finally, I'll show you a couple of studies using navigation and bees, right? There are also various motor tasks, right? Pick the tray with n items or press something n times. And those are also studies that I'll show you. Great fun. Okay, so I have been doing a lot of talking, and I'm going to show you some videos in a minute. Before that, I'm just going to repeat a cautionary tale, which is the story of Clever Hans. How many of you have heard of Clever Hans? Yeah, a couple of people. So basically, Clever Hans is this horse whose trainer firmly felt that Hans had learned a bunch of things, including how to speak German, how to count, and how to tell you what what date it is if you say what is Tuesday, right? Hans seemed to be able to tell you tap out. So what was the readout? The readout was that Hans would tap his hoof against some a board. That board, and you could give Hans a mathematical sum, and Hans would be able to do it, and so on and so forth. And the trainer was remarkably scientific in his outlook, and he was not running a scam. Of course, he was doing a touring circus with Hans, but he genuinely believed, Van Osten believed, that his horse genuinely had this ability, and he opened up Hans to the scientific community, saying, "Come and run your test. Like, do what you want. I really think I have a genius horse." And so this is a story that I open one of my critical thinking classes with, because it's amazing how many students who have sort of made their way through a biology degree via rote learning find it difficult to figure out. Suppose Hans is in front of you now. What are the questions you would ask? How would you design the experiment to figure out whether Hans is legitimately a mathematical genius, as Van Osten said, or not? And to sort of give away the answer, because we can't go through that entire exercise in time today, the psychologists realized that Hans could do these tasks even without Van Osten present. So the usual charge that the trainer's running a scam was clearly off. In the lab, of course, it took a while for the horse to get used to someone else, but the horse was able to learn and respond to someone who was not Van Osten in the lab, where all sensory stimuli were fully, controlled. So the question, so many people felt that that's it. But and this is the point at which most people get stumped. What do you do next? And it turns out that if you look at Hans's error rate, it reveals something. So when the experimenter, this new scientific experimenter who was not Van Osten, did not know the answer to the questions that they were asking, somehow the horse didn't either. And of course, then if you try to block in various ways the horse from seeing the experimenter, including putting blinders on the horse or having the experimenter in another room communicating via microphone, then the horse didn't seem to be able to do the task. Okay, so so essentially Hans was an incredible horse, right? But what Hans was doing was reading cues from experimenters who did not intend to give cues. And so this is a useful cautionary tale in how the experimenter influences the outcomes of experiments without even necessarily wanting to. And basically, Hans seemed to be tapping his foot until the experimenter looked like the correct result had been achieved, and then stopping, right? So if the experimenter said, what's 2 + 2, Hans would tap 4 times, and then something changed about the experimenter, leading Hans to stop tapping, right? So, yeah, very perceptive horse, but not, as it turns out, a numerically particularly gifted horse. And that's Van Osten, who I truly commend for being one of these early kind of people who clearly showed that it's not necessarily kind of people outside the academy who are running scams per se, but that the way we do experiments, the way we structure them, and our cautions around them, that inform how you can make careful inferences from experiments. Okay? And this is useful also because we try and see how we can do citizen science, how we can train non-scientists, people without even a school degree, to do scientific experiments with an understanding that they need to learn specific lessons about how to be cautious about interpreting results, how they influence results, how, so basically to teach what it means to run a controlled experiment to people who've not had necessarily a school degree, because in theory, none of these skills are taught in a school, right? They're actually, skills that scientists learn on the job, and you shouldn't have to have a school degree in order to run experiments with a nearby dog. So that's, those, I'll show you the experiments that we've done with dogs towards the end, although I don't think we'll have time for data. Okay, so before that, I'm going to show you a quick video of chimpanzees and how they gather, how they do a task. The reason I want to show you this clip, well, you'll see in a minute. So in the old days, when numerical and linguistic cognition work was done with chimps, chimps were, it was very intensive one-on-one teaching. And, chimps basically worked all day, right, on experiments. And there were very weird, there were very sort of interesting and strange experimental results that seemed to have depended on that particular modality of teaching chimps. This work, although it was eventually shut down, was carried out in Japan by this chimp researcher named Matsuzawa, who revolutionized how the work is done by letting chimps play outdoors in a very large, well-funded kind of space. But the chimps could volunteer to go to a little sort of cubicle where they would do these experiments. They would start the experiments on their own by tapping on a screen. And then the experiment would unfold. They would play it like a video game. They get a little piece of raisin every time they do this task. And so, you can sort of assume that the chimp is into it, either for love of, raisin or for love of the game itself, not necessary to see which. So I'll play this clip, but I may have to worry a little bit about sound. I'm doing an infinite mirror, which is not strongly recommended. Let's see if I can project sound. I hope it's not too loud. Let's see if I can control sound here. Not really. It's not really playing, no? Okay, so I'll play it. I'll just have to do the entertaining soundtrack myself. Okay, so you can see this chimp. You see what task it's doing. So it's picking numbers. There are numbers on the screen and it's tapping them in order. That's the reward, okay? Being auto swept out every time the chimp gets the answer right. So there's no human influencing the outcome of this experiment, okay? Okay, so watch the chimp do it, okay? Not only can the chimp do this, as it turns out, faster than humans can, but if the letters are blacked out right after, the numbers are blacked out right after, they're still able to do it accurately, right? In record speed. Now, I've essentially played this task 3 or 4 times, and you've all seen that the chimp is doing it quicker than you can. And so essentially, and then of course, once the chimp is done, it just says thank you and bye-bye. And you can find the rest of this clip on YouTube, and you can test yourself to see if you can be trained to do this task at the same rate at the chimp. I know it's real, it's not fake, it's not a fake AI video. Excellent question, Debbie. So it's a real video, right? And you can test yourself. Of course, the experimenters also wondered whether human beings could be trained. It turns out that the best representatives of our species at this task are 7 to 8-year-olds who seem to do much better than us as adults. So you can try this task one day at the at the Chimp Research Center. And it turns out that, yeah, it's real. It's totally real. So it turns out that when humans do this task, their error rate is still, I mean, even our best foot forward, the 8-year-olds who do as many trials as the chimps have, they're still not able to go past picking 3 or 4 of the numbers in the correct order, whereas chimps are able to do it. I just present this data to make it obvious that, even though we, in theory, imagine that there must be some tasks that non-humans are better at than humans. This is one example of something that's been found. One's typically not well-funded to look for these things. Matsuzawa himself managed to do this for some years before, the facility got shut down for various reasons. So, but it's pretty cool work. Monkeys also have been trained to do a bunch of these tasks. The task I showed you was a task where it looks like chimps' visual memories plus their ability to sort of pick things in order. Some combination of those abilities is better than what humans can do. But we know that chimps are able to do a bunch of impressive mathematical tasks, many of which we can do as well or better than them. And I'm going to show you one more video before I lapse into more boring graphs. This is a bird, right, called an African gray parrot. And the African gray parrot also shows some surprising abilities. So let's see if we can play this as a clip. We don't have this on. Let's see if it exists on YouTube, just so we see if it's playable. And then I can actually consider switching back to my speakers. I am silly. Okay, so I'm just going to play this full screen and hope that it presents to everybody. I'm just going to put my mic here in the hope that that picks up the sound.
Whoa, good boy. No matter. Rock, good birdie. Griffin is the kind of student who says, tell me what I have to do to get the A. And then he'll do it really, really well. We did a formal study. It sounds quite simple, but it's really difficult. Imagine 4 colored pom-poms of these, here's our little pom-poms. You cover them with little cups, and then you start moving them in a certain pattern. Only then would I ask you, okay, where's the yellow one? So you have to keep track of all 4 of them. We used Harvard students, and we gave them the same exact task as Griffin. And he either matched or beat them up to 3 moves. Only when we got to 3 and 4 moves did his abilities start to decrease and get below theirs. The reason these birds do so well on the cognitive tasks we give them is that surprisingly, although their brain is the size of a shelled walnut, it is so densely packed with neurons that the density is comparable to that of non-human primates.
Cheebrums, 6, good bird.
The last common ancestor that we had with parrots was back at the dinosaurs 300+ million years ago. We do think that this manipulation ability, some limited aspect of it, probably goes back to a common ancestor, and then it developed over time so that you get to this much more complicated, complex ability now.
All right. So Alex the parrot is interesting for multiple reasons. As you can see, Alex the parrot can speak, right? Can be trained to speak, and for gratifyingly for Americans, can be trained to speak English with an American accent, like all the aliens in those alien movies, right? So there is no question of Alex's, well, so first of all, many questions that we thought were inaccessible with animals are now accessible with the Alex, the parrots of the world. So the gray parrots in general, there's some work on them. I have to say though that Irene Pepperberg is one of those examples of the many women in behavioral biology who worked on these kinds of questions, whose work was largely undervalued. She mentions that she worked with Harvard students, but she was never given a faculty position at Harvard, even though I would argue that this is groundbreaking work, right? And a lot of the initial work with chimps and dolphins and all of that were all work done by women. They were work that involved complicated, empathetic, relationships built with animals. And they were often, with good reason, there was skepticism about the clever Hans type phenomenon playing out, because there was a lot of, cue giving clearly back and forth. But every one of these scientists used that empathetic relationship to build up cognitive skills, and then tested them in controlled ways. And as you can see, you don't see that in this video, but there are several published experiments that are well controlled, right, by the Pepperberg lab, and she never got a faculty position despite despite all of that. So, but she eventually got space to do the work. Had to move around a bit from institution to institution, but there are still very few labs that are funded to do this kind of work, which is so sad because it's clearly an exciting avenue of work. There are many questions that we think we cannot get at in non-humans because we don't share a language with them, right? We can't really understand the depth of cognition of various humans whom we don't share a language with. We just assume that, they're thinking the same deep thoughts that we are. But it's not, you don't get a sense of that cognitive depth until you share a language. And this is a bird that, is able to speak our language since we're not able to speak parrot squawkies or whatever you would like to call it. And so you reach a point at which you can ask Alex interesting and complicated questions. Some of the things, of course, Alex could do with his command over the English language was to say, I don't want to do this, or, I'm tired, leave me alone. But of course, a very interesting animal and able to clearly do a bunch of cognitive tasks, including count the number of objects and so on available. So, this is just again to give you a window into the exciting possibilities. Of course, when an animal does this kind of really cool stuff, whether a parrot or a dog, one immediately stops wanting to open up their brains because it's hard to do this. But I will have to say that opening up a brain is not as bad as it sounds, in that brains don't have pain neurons inside them, right? They are receiving pain-sensitive neurons from the rest of the body. So actually, brain surgery is like dental surgery. You get a local anesthetic. You don't need to have general anesthesia for brain surgery. And so you just need to make sure that the skin receptors, wherever you're drilling, are sedated. It's unpleasant like dental surgery. I have a friend who's undergone, a couple now, was a student and a friend who've undergone brain surgery. So they describe it as very unpleasant to feel your head being drilled into, just like dental surgery, except much worse. But it's not painful. And they sometimes have to stay awake for the duration of the surgery so that the surgeons are getting live feedback. So one friend of mine with a temporal lobe tumor, the surgery would cut away parts of the temporal lobe that are involved in language production. So she had to stay awake and talking all through, because if something, they were pretty sure, they were cutting conservatively, but they still wanted to make sure that while the surgery was on, if there's a snip that starts to produce, a problem, that they'll get live feedback while it's happening. So, so this is just to say that, there is a possibility that, properly informed humans might decide to, say, well, I'm willing to undergo brain surgery so that our brains can be understood. But, right now you only get permission to record from brains, and that to just the surface. If somebody needs surgery, usually for a tumor or for severe epilepsy that's not controllable by medication. Okay, so, various, in not parrots, but in crows, as well as in monkeys, Andreas Nieder has been doing a series of experiments to look at whether number-sensitive neurons can be found, right? And these are what are called electrophysiology experiments, where recordings are done from the brain. Nida was able to find a bunch of interesting cells that are tuned to a number, and he's able to train crows to do these tasks and record from their brains and primates. Very cool stuff, often single author experiments. So Andreas Nida, fairly clearly doing something unusual in biology, saying, I'm doing these experiments by myself, right? It's often not work done with students. He was able to find these neurons. So neurons in the insects that I work on are lovely. They're silent most of the time. So you show them a stimulus and then they give you a gratifying looking response. But cells in our cortices or monkey cortex or the bird equivalent of cortex are not like that. They are noisy, so they're constantly active. And then you show a stimulus, and then having shown a stimulus, what you're looking at is an increase in the rate of firing. So that you can see many repeats of the presentation of a stimulus here. Each black dot is the neuron firing or showing activity. And then the firing rate is shown in the graph below. So they were able to find studies in these studies that there were neurons that specifically only fired when 2 dots were presented to the animal. The task is a delayed match to numerosity task, right? So you're shown 3 dots, black dots. You're showing these to the monkey. And then with some delay, the delay has to be variable because you want to see how long this is committed to memory. So you have to hold that representation in memory and then compare it to 3 different dots. The differentness of the dots is important because clearly pattern matching itself will not solve this task, right? They have to match the numerosity of the first thing they were shown with the numerosity of the second thing that they're shown. And as you can see, the dots are all different sizes so that the surface area control kind of is done. And with the match, the exact match, the alternatives are non-matched numbers. So on a given trial, an animal is either shown a match to what they were shown earlier or a non-match consisting of 4 dots or 2 dots, right? And basically, one is looking at the neurons that fire when the animal picks the correct match versus when the animal does not pick the correct match. So if a cell fires during both kinds of trials, it would not be considered a number selective kind of cell, right? So he's done work like this in birds and mammals, as I said, and found neurons which seem to be tuned to a particular numerosity of the stimulus. So each of these colored tuning curves is a neuron that preferred number 2, showed, for example, in this study in crows, you can see that there's some response even for numbers 1 and 3, but the neuron really shows its highest response at 2. Likewise, you have neurons that show their highest response at 3 in green, highest response at 4, etc. And this was found in birds, monkeys, and humans. And this really is kind of the life work of Andreas Nida. Very, very cool work, but it shows you how little we know. We're just about finding neurons that represent number, right, in the field, and not a representation of it. Okay, this is just to point out that we're actually looking at different number-sensitive structures in fish, which I work on, birds and humans. I'll explain why I work on fish in a while, but they all seem to be different parts of the brain that have number coding ability. And then, there's a bunch of, further work that one can show on how each of these animals does numerical cognition. And I'll just point out that what you can do in humans is far more sophisticated in terms of the kind of numerical task and mathematical task you can ask them to do. But this is data using what's called fMRI. fMRI is basically looking at the depletion of oxygen from blood in your brain and the way in which essentially iron in your blood, in hemoglobin, interacts with oxygen. It basically interacts with a magnetic field slightly differently when it's bound to oxygen and when oxygen is not bound. So deoxygenation of the blood can be looked at in the whole brain. So you can provide a magnetic field and then look at how the tissue interacts with that magnetic field. And that gives you a sense of which parts of the brain are busily depleting oxygen and therefore presumably active. So a little bit like, seeing who solves a problem by tracking food supply to each lab and assuming that whoever's solving a problem is going to be eating a lot of food, right? So it's an indirect technique of assessing, which part of the brain might be doing the task. But it's relatively well validated at this stage relative to what I showed you earlier, which are direct electrical recordings from single neurons. That's what Andreas Nieder's lab did. So for example, you can see the experiments that people were asked to do and the parts of the brain that lit up. I'm not going to tell you what each part of the brain is because they're just names. I want you to get a sense of what kinds of data one can get from humans. And that's what you can get is when you ask somebody to think about whether LP spaces are separable versus the Paris metro was built before the Istanbul metro, two different tasks that involve consideration analysis. One is a mathematical task and one is not. Then you see which parts of the brain are active during that task versus during the control task. And so you can do this with increasingly complicated operations to see which neighborhood in the brain is involved. Right, and you can do problems in analysis, algebra, topology, geometry, non-math, right? So this is the kind of work that, and a lot of this work is driven by Stanislas Dehaene, who's also written an accessible book called The Number Sense, a public book. So Stan Dehaene works on numerical cognition and consciousness, all of these big questions in humans and a little bit in apes as well. And then, of course, just simple a plus b times a minus b equals a square minus b square, like when you ask somebody to do that kind of task, what parts of the brain are involved, et cetera, okay? So basically, you find various neighborhoods where something might be happening and we don't know what is happening in those neighborhoods. Right? So it's interesting, but it's limited in terms of what we can infer about how this is being done. And of course, lots of work on math versus non-math, et cetera. So I'm going to skip ahead and not go over which parts of the brain were involved, et cetera. And I'm going to skip over this as well. And just point out that in the monkey brain, you have the prefrontal cortex, which is this part of your brain that's involved in many of these tasks. In the human brain, also, we think the number network is kind of broadly located in the prefrontal cortex. And you can kind of see that over here. That green end over there in front is the prefrontal cortex. But you can actually see that the prefrontal cortex is not as active in complex math, as areas that are further back in the brain. And the prefrontal cortex is thought to house all of the interesting things that humans do, but it turns out that's not the case for complex math. So the parts of the brain that even mediate consciousness or conscious awareness or processing don't seem to be involved, are not the same areas that are involved in complex math. So a bunch of interesting surprises that evolve from this. Okay, so I'll just skip ahead a little bit, and there are various proposed circuits that might involve some that might do some of this work. I'll now move to animals and tell you what we know behaviorally in terms of animals and why animals can be useful to look at and how they can reveal insights that are of use to humans as well. And then I'll quickly give you a sense of the kind of stuff we do in the lab. And I'm aware that I'm running slightly out of time, right? So I have about maybe 10 minutes left. Okay. So, all right, I'm going to skip over some of this stuff, but maybe I'll describe this experiment because I really like what it tells us about humans. So this is an experiment in which rats were asked to press one lever if they heard either, so they were either trained on a duration task or a number of pulses type task. But let's take this task for now. 2 pulses were played to a rat, and the rat had to press the left lever if they heard 2 pulses. And in the training protocol, the alternative was 8 pulses, which took the same total time, right? And if they heard 8, they would have to press the right lever. So in this task then, the animals are trained until they do this task fairly well, right? They're at 90% accuracy. And then they are provided with intermediate tones. And the surprising thing that emerges from these data is that if you look at the tuning curve for how they transition from looking at what do they think of intermediate numbers, you can see that if you're pressing the right lever for 8, right, they're getting that almost 100% of the time. And if they're trained on 2, right, so they're pressing the other lever almost all the time. Therefore, they're pressing the lever that's being represented here, almost 0% of the time, right? So what happens at intermediate numbers? Well, when they're played 3 sounds like 2, so they're largely pressing the 2 wala lever. When they hear 6, which sounds like 8 pulses, and they have to choose between representing it as 2 versus representing it as 8, they're largely picking 8. But the number where they are equally likely to press 2 and 8, right, is not 5, which is the arithmetic intermediate between 2 and 8, but 4, which is the logarithmic intermediate between 2 and 8. And so what this tells us is that rats are doing their quantitative cognition on a multiplicative scale rather than an additive scale, or on a log scale, you can think of it, right? And then, of course, there's an interesting throwaway story in here, which is that if you give if you give the rats stimulants, meth, the whole curve shifts a little bit to the right. So in general, as I've said, we think of the reward system, which is what methamphetamines work on, as being crucial to the ability to measure time and number. And methamphetamines shift the way in which basic numerical cognition is done along this curve. But this is perhaps not surprising, because all of your quantitative estimates of light intensity, sound intensity, and so on are also on multiplicative scales, right? So when sound is louder by what sounds like 1 step up, that's a decibel louder. You know that decibel is on a log scale. And likewise, when, I can give you demonstrations of this, when, 2 sequences of increasing light intensity look like roughly equivalent steps, they are often 2-fold or 10-fold larger, right? So it looks like many of our sensory systems work on, follow what's called Weber's law, which is the idea that they follow a log scale. And so it's perhaps not surprising that our quantitative abstraction from those senses also follows a log scale. But it's also interesting to me that we typically teach logs to students, fairly late in their schooling, and they really all struggle with it. Whereas perhaps if you're not teaching a linear number line in the first place, it might be an intuitive way in which quantities are understood, right? So this is just to say that, therefore, experiments in rats, even if one's not using animals just for the ability to poke at their brains, might still provide us interesting windows into cognition in humans. Okay, so I'll just, this is just examples from visual stimuli. I'll just add one more thing about, the literature on animal numerical cognition, which is to introduce, bees as the surprise kind of, front runner of many of these experiments. Bees can be trained to land on the smaller of 2 sets, right? They can famously, they spontaneously famously land on 0 as smaller than any of the sets of numbers that are shown. So there was a whole paper that was just about how bees recognize that 0 is less than everything else, even though they're only trained on choosing the smaller set of numbers. Bees seem to be able to go up to essentially the number 7, whereas many non-human animals seem to only go up to sort of 3 or 4 in terms of being able to keep track of numbers without losing accuracy. So this is just to say that apart from, the work on numerical cognition in animals, myth-busting the idea of kind of human absolute superiority, in cognitive ability quite a bit, there's also, it's not necessary that vertebrates with their larger brains are going to outperform invertebrates with their smaller brains. As I've said, many of these tasks don't need a particularly large set of neurons to be built by an engineer. In theory, an engineer can build something that does numerical cognition with 3 neurons or 2 neurons even. But the question is essentially, is one of which brains happen to have the circuitry that lend themselves to doing this kind of task. It's a question of how those neurons are pre-wired together, how they receive information, and so on, rather than how much computational power is there overall sitting in the cranium. Okay, so I'll just show you one classic example from the bee literature that I really like, which was the elicitation of numerical tasks from navigation. So bees were taught to go to, past 3 landmarks and then take a right, essentially, if they wanted to get a reward. And then they were confused by a test paradigm in which the number of feeders was artificially crammed into a shorter distance so that they could see whether the bees are actually just flying the distance that those feeders previously covered and then taking a right, or are they actually counting the number of landmarks? And in every study that has looked at this kind of question in this particularly clever way, the cool thing that you find, and at this stage, I trust all of these experiments much more than I trust some of the more recent experiments in numerical cognition, you find that the majority of bees are just using distance cues. So when you cram the landmarks into a shorter space, they're flying past the third landmark. A small fraction of the bees are turning after the third landmark. But most bees are flying all the way, the full distance that they did before and then turning to the right. This is what one might consider an example of neurodivergence within bees, right? The idea that when provided with mixed cues, cues where the distance and the number of landmarks is typically not manipulated, right? You can use the distance to make your turn, or you can count the number of landmarks to make your turn. It looks like most bees use distance. And in task after task after task, you see the avoidance of counting-based approaches versus distance-based approaches and so on in most animals, leading one to speculate that relying on numerical cues is sort of a minority phenomenon, not just in humans, but in many animal species. Right? And we find something similar in our work. So I'm going to skip ahead quickly and tell you what we do in the lab. We work with zebrafish, and the reason that we work with zebrafish is that zebrafish are a largish animal which can handle presumably some complexity of tasks, but it's also the animal, there are only 2 or 3 model systems where you can actually look at every neuron in the brain with single neuron resolution. And zebrafish are one of those animals. The other is C. elegans, which is a tiny worm, right, with a very limited number of neurons. And so far, no demonstrated ability to do mathematical cognition or numerical cognition tasks. But can zebrafish do math? What kinds of mathematical tasks can they do and not do? This is the kind of work that we can do. And we work with collaborators to see whether we can monitor the brain, once we find something interesting. So we sometimes ask zebrafish in some of our experiments to just choose between groups of zebrafish of different sizes and see whether they prefer larger social groups. And we also do experiments of another kind where we teach them to look at symbols that predict the amount of reward they will get. So in this particular paradigm, for example, the zebrafish is moving towards a screen. If the zebrafish, and what they see on the screen is 2 lines on the right versus 1 on the left. The odd, whether the 2 lines are on the right or the left is randomized from trial to trial so that they're not just turning left or right, based on remembering that, the last time I got a reward when I turned right. And so these are randomized, but wherever the fish goes, they get as much reward in the form of food pellets as the number of lines they see on the screen. And the question is, can zebrafish learn this task, right? So if the zebrafish turns towards the right, where it sees 2 lines, then it'll get 2 pellets of food dropped in, right? And we film them for long enough to make sure that they've actually gone and eaten the pellets, because that's an important, marker for us. And this is, real data to just give you a sense of what this looks like. So we lift up the barrier. The zebrafish is now free to do the task. The zebrafish goes in there. As you can see, it's not like a linear path. Moves around, but goes towards the 2 pieces, and then you can kind of see it grab the 2 pieces of food that we dropped in. Right? It sort of did a quick grab in 2 directions, and those were the 2 tiny pieces of food we dropped in. However, if you look at the population, they're not learning the task, right? Their behavior is sort of fairly erratic from day to day. And if you take cumulative data, then it becomes really, really clear. They're really at 50%. They're tossing the die, right? They're not learning this task. So then we try to figure out what about the tasks makes it so hard. So we had various questions. Some were really banal, like, do they even want food, right? Yes, they move towards food when you drop it into a tank, but do they care about 2 versus 1? Maybe they're just like, food is better than no food, and I don't really care about whether it's 2 pellets versus 1 pellet, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, we have to drop the pellets in afterwards, because if the pellets are there ahead of time, then they could just be smelling their way to the source of food. So once they make a choice based on what they see in the screen, then the pellets are dropped in. So we tried to see whether they could do the task if they were just given reward versus no reward, because the task that we showed them earlier was a new task that had not been previously demonstrated in the literature, but the literature had amply shown that zebrafish can distinguish between 2 lines and 1 line. That's why we use that paradigm for a reward. So we decided to just say, let's keep the total amount of food that you would get if you got this right correct, 2 pellets. So you get 2 pellets if you do the task, and you get no pellets if you don't do the task. And the interesting thing is that when we do the same task as before, again, a lot of fish don't do the task, but some of them start to, from initially kind of showing random-ish responses, they start to move towards an 80% average ability to move towards the 2 pellets. And this is not all fish doing the task. This is a subset of fish. This is our best 5 fish. The rest of the fish collectively are not doing the task. We trust these results more than some of the results where people report all zebrafish doing a task, or we think that perhaps the difference is that we use wild zebrafish, whereas most people use lab strains that have been, wild zebrafish are found in India, right? But this is the home territory of zebrafish. So if you want to work with wild zebrafish, this is the space. Wild zebrafish seem to show, again, a range of abilities like those bees, where only some of them are able to do this task when it's repeated, and some of them are not. Most of them are not. And of course, we also did a little sanity check. So you can see even when you do cumulative, there's a shift from 50% to 60% across all fish. And then we tried to see, can they do 2 versus 1 if we're not complicating the task by switching, randomizing whether 2 is on the left and 1 is on the right? Let's make the task super simple for them. They can either use the number or they can use spatial cognition to turn left or right to get the reward. And it turns out that if you do that, more fish are able to do the task than before. They're again able to show some increase in learning when the task is simplified. So our answer to the question of can zebrafish do math basically is some can, and it depends on the task complexity. If you want to really control for and infer that they're doing numerical versus quantitative cognition, they're not doing the task at that level. But they are able to do quantitative cognition, where they are specifically able to, infer, broadly speaking, for reward versus no reward. And even simpler and more ecologically relevant, usually if you found 2 pieces of food on the right of the road, you'd keep kind of revisiting that side of the road until, say, it's depleted. And finally, I'll just talk briefly for a minute or two about the other things we do in the lab. No more data, right? And so we work on other kinds of quantitative cognition as well. One of the sets of things we look at is what in behavioral economics is called the decoy effect. When choices are being made between quantities of things, how does adding a third attribute, a third item to the choice set change choice-based behavior? So you have 2 choices and then you're given a third option. How does that third option switch the preference between the first 2 options? So we do a bunch of work of that kind. These are social choices. Zebrafish can choose between groups of 2 versus groups of 4 fish, make a decision, and then we see what changes when we add an extra fish as a possibility, as a distractor. And so this is the kind of data that involves 2 fish on that side, 4 fish on this side. As you can see, the zebrafish is preferring to shoal with the larger group of 4, and we look at how adding a distractor changes this. It turns out that the answer is specific to the order in which you present the choice set, the number that is involved in the choice set, whether one zebrafish is making this decision or multiple zebrafish are making the decision. So a grad student in the lab, Abhishek, is doing this work where we sort of automate the trajectory from what the fish is doing and use that to generate options. And then we work with Dino, who's a behavioral economist, and Florian, who's a neuroscientist, and works on the brains, on zebrafish brains. I'll show you some data from Florian's lab as an example of how powerful the zebrafish model system is. And this is, the zebrafish is turning left or right. You can see the brain twinkling like a Christmas light because every neuron in the zebrafish brain has a calcium indicator in it that indicates when the neuron is about to release neurotransmitter. So you actually can, with this, get a much clearer sense than you can from human fMRI data of there is a neuron that first twinkles and then another neuron twinkles followed by a third. So you at least get a sense of how many neurons are sequentially involved in a computation, et cetera, and you're not just left with kind of this neighborhood is involved when the task is solved, et cetera. And finally, the experiment I showed you in fish, we ended up trying with domestic dogs during the lockdown because students were stuck at home with no way to do fish experiments. So we said, okay, work with your domestic dogs, but you're going to have to control the space. So you're going to have to sweep it out, get rid of all odor cues. You have to put up saris or sheets or whatever you have in the house to make it like a lab. There have to be no cues, from a clock or whatever on the wall. Here's the second dog, again, having learned that, if they choose two, they will get 2 pieces of meat. Also, this doesn't work if you use biscuits. Dogs don't care about 2 biscuits versus 1 biscuit. They care about 2 meat biscuits versus 1 meat biscuit. So we had to tell all the vegetarians, I don't know whether you want to inform your family that you are bringing meat biscuits in the house, but if you're willing to do it, you can do this experiment. Otherwise, the dogs just don't care. Okay. And these are our star dogs, which then performed well on this task. Again, 4 dogs were able to do this task. The majority of dogs were not able to do this task. They got distracted. Many of the ones that didn't do the task were heavily side biased. Ek bar left gaya, I got a reward. They just keep going to the left even. So the randomization again was confusing for them, and so on and so forth. Right? So I'll just end with, the very large list of students who ended up working on dogs in their homes before we were able to get 4 dogs that did the task, and about 10 more that didn't, and another 15 to 16 that did not even lend themselves to testing. Our hypothesis was actually our street dogs must be super smart because, they navigate all this stuff on the street. So we first tried working with the street dogs right outside campus, and that was a bust. They refused to enter the experimental arena one by one, let alone focus on the task. They were super distracted and, really, really socially engaged with both the humans and other dogs, but not like they didn't want to kind of do what domestic dogs were willing to do, which is, okay, you're telling me to, to move somewhere for food, I'll do it. I'm bored, I have nothing else to do. So it was interesting that our hypothesis that strays would outperform pets did not hold up. There are a few other model systems that we work on in the lab. We also work on how the neurons that are involved in communication systems in insects, but I haven't spoken about that leg of the work that we do in the lab. And we've not also fully connected the ways in which communication and quantitative circuits might overlap, because we work on communication in one system and we work on quantity in another system, fish. But fish can also communicate, and they both hear and produce some vocalizations. And these new varieties of zebrafish, also found in India and Bangladesh, are even more interesting because they're full adults, which are the size and transparency of larval zebrafish. So their brains are miniaturized. They'll probably be doing everything very differently from zebrafish, but they're an intriguing system and they do a lot of vocal communication. So this is the system where we think both the communication and quantitative cognition circuits can be looked at together. And then we do a bunch of other projects driven by psychology undergrads in the lab who want to stress fish out, depress them, give them drugs that will ameliorate the depression, and so on and so forth. So we do a bunch of other work of that kind as well. So in summary, we're hoping that our research paradigm will enable us to test exact kind of numerical cognition. There are various ways that animals do some numerical tasks, but it's often only a fraction of the population that can do these tasks. It's possible that zebrafish are not going to be the system where one can tease apart numeracy from quantitative cognition, but there are some labs that have found zebrafish, that can do these tasks. It's entirely possible that they've also been through some rounds of artificial selection for doing that particular kind of task, because it's easy to believe that labs will continue working with fish because you can choose which fish to breed in your lab to keep the line going. So it's possible that one can artificially select for the ability to do that particular task with various trade-offs for other kind of life history traits, etc. And there are broader questions that we're interested in, such as, do features of neural hardware shape performance, or do they constrain performance, with implications for both pedagogy and for the ways in which we do research. And I'm always interested in, talking to people who work on quantitative cognition or are dealing with the strengths and limitations of their own brains, to think of, what for you are paradigms of numerical counting, or of numerical or quantitative or abstract thinking that you'd like to see tested in animals, and so on and so forth. All right, so I will stop there. Thank you very much.
A few questions. Is there anyone online? If you are there, you could just have to unmute yourself.
So yeah, it's very, I'm sure it's a nuanced sort of material, but please feel free to write to me if you have any
Yeah.
questions or even suggestions or sort of, this is what I think you should do. This is the kind of thing I think you should work on, et cetera, et cetera.
Very interesting. But we'll just thank you for a very interesting talk.
All right. Thank you very much.